Last week we discussed nature as the foundation of the substantive economy. Clearly, taking care of nature so it can continue taking care of us makes sense. The Haudenosaunee teaching that one should live in a way that our descendants 7 generations down the line can live as good a life as we do is an economic principle that ensures subsistence for all future generations. In the Western tradition, we equate this principle with the term sustainability. There are many ways people express their concern for the environment. A particular popular way of caring for the environment is protecting natural areas, in particular by preventing them from development. This idea was born out of a philosophy that people would find spiritual transcendence and a refuge from modernity by spending time in untouched wilderness. Perhaps the most influential thinker of this school was John Muir, the chief advocate for the formation of Yosemite National Park in California. Muir's writing and lobbying popularized the idea of environmental protections. His poetry has inspired the conservation movement with famous quotes like, "The clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness." National parks and other protected areas are popular not just for their environmental value, but also because they offer opportunities for recreation and tourism. They often shape myths and stories around which people gather in national unity. Have you ever wondered why else some protected areas are called national parks? There you go. The primary goal of protected areas is not always apparent. Muir had an interest in environmental protection for its own sake, but often recreational opportunities, in particular for elite tourists, dominate. In many European colonies in Africa and Asia, nature parks were created for white colonists to go trophy hunting, such as the Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. Initially, it was exceptionally scenic places that were protected, such as the Yosemite or Yellowstone valleys. But soon more humble places with great biodiversity were also protected. Muir's wilderness ideals have inspired conservation movements and initiatives across the world, from the international to the local level. When activists are protecting a wetland in your community, there's probably someone citing the poetry of John Muir. Now, as sociologists, we want to know how environmental conservation affects people. When we do that, we must conclude that the track record of the conservation movement is more somber than the heroic narrative of Muir and other nature writers. The recreational value of nature parks is unquestioned. No other place offers better conditions for hiking, hunting, and camping like national parks, state parks, or game lands. These activities contribute to local economies because visitors stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, and drink in bars. Developed natural amenities also attract affluent residents and retirees, at least for their second home. For formerly resource-dependent communities, amenity-based development can be a way to diversify their economy and bring in much-needed revenue. The environmental value of conservation areas is more difficult to determine. Again, there are unquestionable benefits. Parks can be a way of protecting endangered species and ecosystems, and they can provide opportunities for environmental education. But this protection is limited to the preserved area and a small number of species. Ironically, area-based protection has been used to justify environmentally harmful land use practices elsewhere. For example, there's the idea of sustainable intensification of agriculture, which proposes that if more food is grown on less acres using high-tech cultivation practices, more land can be put aside for conservation. Whether this all adds up, however, is questionable. It has been shown that extensively used cultural landscapes in which humans interact carefully with their environment are not only more biodiverse than intensively farmed areas, but also more diverse than wilderness areas in which no human activity takes place. This makes sense, because ecological succession has it that in undisturbed ecosystems, the most competitive species replace a greater variety of less competitive pioneer species, and so biodiversity narrows over time. As a result, it is the working landscapes of peasants and indigenous peoples who introduce frequent disturbances that have the highest diversity of species on this planet, not protected wilderness areas. And this leads us to what is perhaps the greatest irony and injustice with regard to conservation. More often than not, areas are protected by banning the traditional guardians of these places, who have created these landscapes in the first place. Wilderness is almost always a product of enclosures. We think of them as natural, but keeping people out of an area is no less a human intervention than farming, logging, or burning. Only small patches of the world, such as rocky mountaintops and glaciers, are natural wilderness. too hostile for human life. Almost all other areas of the world have been cultivated by human communities. Recent anthropological studies found that even the Amazon, long perceived as the world's largest wilderness, is a cultural landscape produced by controlled fires and forest gardening by indigenous peoples. These practices were invisible to European colonizers, who could not conceive of cultural landscapes as anything else but farms, hedgerows, and regularly harvested forests. In our class about settler colonialism, we discussed the Eurocentric ideology of terra nullius, that conceived of the Americas, but also many areas in Africa and Asia, as uninhabited, despite the undeniable presence of indigenous peoples. But even in areas not managed by indigenous peoples, environmental conservation often conflicts with traditional land-based livelihoods. For instance, in many parks in the West, federal agencies often put strict restrictions on how many cattle may graze for how long on a certain piece of land, which interferes with the livelihood of local ranchers. In Europe, national parks protect climax forests from being commercially used, although traditional peasant agroforestry and agriculture are generally more biodiverse. This approach to conservation often violates the human and civil rights of peasants and indigenous peoples, who were the original custodians of these protected lands. Mark Spence called this approach wilderness by dispossession, referring to Mark's account of primitive accumulation. Lands, formerly held in common, were forcefully taken to create landscapes that appeal to bourgeois ideas of pristine nature. Others have called this form of enclosure fortress conservation. But whether conservation areas restrict traditional land uses or not, what prospects does recreation-based development hold for rural communities? For communities who are facing persistent job losses in their traditional land-based industries, developing opportunities for outdoor recreation has become an important economic factor, attracting both tourists and affluent back to the land urbanites. In particular, scenic areas such as the Intermountain West, the Pacific Northwest, or many coastal communities, so-called amenity migration has reversed the rural flight and brought much-needed revenue to municipal coffers. This development has improved the bottom line of these communities, but whether it helps the people who grew up there is debatable. In her ethnography about the fictitious community of Paradise Valley in Washington state, rural sociologist Jennifer Sherman finds that the influx of affluent residents attracted by natural amenities can disturb rural working-class communities. More often than not, the new residents come from urban centers and bring not only money, but also a fundamentally different lifestyle and worldview that the original residents, Sherman calls them old-timers, struggle to relate to. But even worse, the new wealth drives up property prices and taxes, so that many of the old-timers no longer can afford an own home in the community of their childhood. We know this process as rural gentrification. In consequence, Sherman's article questions whether amenity-based development really is a good model for rural communities. I want to close the lecture by pointing out that exclusive fortress conservation is not the only approach to environmental protections. When John Muir lobbied for the creation of national parks, he was opposed by another conservationist, Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot's vision was to manage public lands for the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. The greatest good for the greatest number meant that Pinchot would ban devastating practices like clear-cutting, while still allowing for sustainable forestry to create landscapes that maintain local economies, offer recreation opportunities, and ecological diversity. This philosophy has become the foundation for the US Forest Service system, and to this day, national parks and national forests pursue different approaches to conservation. Unlike national parks, national forests also tend to be free to visit and offer recreation opportunities popular with local working-class communities, such as hunting and snowmobiling. But also within the global national park community, there has been a mind shift. Several parks across the world are now embracing local peoples and traditional practices of land stewardship, and are moving away from Muir's wilderness principle, although it still dominates popular imaginations of natural environments. Finally, over the last decades, there has been a recognition that environmental protection must not be limited to certain areas. When Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring, she showed that harmful chemicals and pesticides threatened ecosystems and human health. The answer to this problem was the ban or strict limits on certain chemicals across the United States, not just in small enclosed places. Carson's findings inspired the foundation of the US Environmental Protection Agency, which has since sought to regulate industries and land uses for environmental protection across the nation. How successful the EPA has been is debated. Certainly, the EPA has improved water and air quality across the country, but a lot of rivers and streams are still of poor water quality, and species continue to go extinct at alarming rates. Perhaps this is less the fault of the EPA than of government interference, since environmental protection is often seen as a threat to existing industries and jobs. Painted with broad brushstrokes, we can conclude that the US Environmental Protection Agency, the US National Forest Service, and the US National Park Service exemplify three divergent philosophies of conservation. The EPA seeks to implement protection measures for the entire US. Since this affects the entire economy, these measures are relatively weak, but they can still be effective because of the sheer area on which they are applied. Some people say this approach to conservation is the only one that can create truly sustainable economies, because it requires every industry to come up with production processes that do not burn the environment. Then, you have the US Forest Service, which manages 193 million acres of forest and grasslands. These lands allow for productive land uses such as commercial forestry and grazing, but in a much more restricted way compared to the rest of the country. National forests are also managed to provide a wide range of recreation opportunities and ecological benefits. Finally, you have national parks, which enact the strongest restrictions on productive land uses and which are often exclusively managed for recreation and environmental protection. And while they ensure the perpetuity of iconic landscapes and protect endangered species, they only affect 84.4 million acres, less than half of the area protected by national forests and grasslands. Let's not forget that the jurisdictions of the EPA, the National Forest Service, and the National Park Service are all limited to the United States. In a time when environmental challenges are increasingly global, such as climate change or the loss of biodiversity, there's an increasing need to find global solutions to environmental protection. Although international organizations such as the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and the United Nations have sought to harmonize national responses to environmental degradation, the results have been piecemeal at best. If we take climate change as an example, we see that the issue of international environmental protection is also deeply sociological. Both the emission of harmful greenhouse gases and the exposure to environmental hazards resulting from climate change operate along class lines, in which the wealthiest 10% of the global population emit almost as much greenhouse gas as the bottom 90. But it's the poorest people who suffer the most. In this lecture, I pointed out the tension between environmental protection and productive land uses, and the social implications of both action and inaction regarding protecting the environment. I want you to challenge the bourgeois idea that environmental protection at all costs is automatically good, but that does not mean that conservation is unnecessary. More than ever before in history, the future of human life is at risk because of our reckless treatment of our planet, and much more radical solutions are necessary to confront global threats like climate change or biodiversity loss. But as the examples of this class have shown, it makes a big difference how and by whom environmental protection measures are implemented, and each measure comes with a bundle of different implications for different people. When you go hiking on a trail next time, let nature inspire you like it inspired John Muir, but don't forget that every landscape is the result of people's interactions with it, and that we cannot study or protect them in isolation from the people that live with them.